Medieval times, one father's desperate choice turns his daughter's world upside down in an instant. Imagine watching as your own father offers you in exchange for a horse in the village marketplace. The cruel laughter of onlookers burning into your soul as you realize you're worth less than livestock to the man who raised you. But nothing is as it seems in this tale of betrayal and sacrifice. When a mysterious Viking warrior steps forward to claim the girl, he brings with him secrets that will reshape everything she thought she knew about her father, her village, and herself. What terrible truth could drive a man to sell his only daughter? What blood-soaked past connects this northern warrior to her family? As enemies close in from all sides and time runs out, one question remains. In a world where loyalty can become treason in the blink of an eye, is love strong enough to survive the ultimate betrayal? The village bells tolled across the valley, each somber ring piercing Elin's chest like an invisible blade. She watched her father's hands, calloused from years of toil in fields that never yielded enough, tremble as he gripped her elbow too tightly. Something was wrong. Harold had barely spoken 3 words since dawn when he'd yanked her from sleep and ordered her to don her only clean dress. Now, as he dragged her through the muddy marketplace, his eyes darted frantically, never meeting hers. "Father, please," she whispered, her throat constricting around the words. "What have I done?" But Harold's weathered face remained a mask of stone, jaw clenched so tight she could see a vein pulsing at his temple. The market square buzzed with the usual morning chaos. Fresh bread scented the air, mingling with the acrid stench of burnt leather from the tanner's stall. Merchants haggled loudly over prices while children weaved between legs chasing a mangy dog. But as Harold pulled Elin toward the center, where horses were traded, a strange hush began to spread outward like ripples in a pond. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the crowd parted. Harold's fingers dug deeper into her arm, leaving marks she knew would later bloom purple. When they reached the wooden platform where livestock was displayed, he thrust her forward with such force that she stumbled, catching herself just before falling face first into the filth. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. "I offer my daughter," Harold announced, his voice cracking on the final word, "in exchange for your finest stallion." The world tilted beneath Elin's feet. Her lungs refused to draw breath as her father's words echoed in her mind, impossible to comprehend, yet impossible to deny. The marketplace erupted, first in shocked silence, then in cruel, mocking laughter that cut through her like winter wind through threadbare clothing. A merchant with a greasy beard pointed at her, his belly shaking with amusement. "The girl for a horse? I wouldn't trade a 3-legged mule for such a scrawny thing." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone spat on the ground near her feet. Elin's vision blurred as hot tears welled but refused to fall. She would not give them the satisfaction. The betrayal burned worse than any physical wound she had ever endured. Not the humiliation of being compared to livestock, not the jeers of the villagers she had known her entire life, but the cold, detached look in her father's eyes as he bartered her away, as if she were nothing more than a sack of grain. "Why?" The word tore from her throat, raw and broken. "What have I done to deserve this?" She searched her father's face for any sign of the man who had once sung her to sleep, who had taught her to trap rabbits in the forest, who had wept when her mother died. But that man was gone, replaced by a stranger who couldn't even meet her gaze. Harold's shoulders hunched forward as if bearing an invisible weight. His fingers twisted the frayed edge of his tunic, a nervous habit she had known all her life. But still, he said nothing. No explanation, no comfort, not even the dignity of a reason for this betrayal. The villagers' murmurs grew louder, some whispering with undisguised contempt, others with reluctant pity. Elin felt their stares burning into her skin. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to collapse. Her mind raced between hatred and desperate pleading, unable to settle on either. The world she had known since birth, however harsh and unforgiving it had been, was crumbling around her, leaving nothing solid to grasp. "How much for the wench?" called a drunken voice from the back of the crowd. "I've got a field needs plowing, and not just the soil." Coarse laughter followed, and Elin felt bile rise in her throat. Another voice joined in, I'll give you a chicken and half a wheel of cheese. I'll throw in a broken plow and take her off your hands." Each offer cut deeper than the last. Eileen's fingernails dug into her palms until tiny crescents of blood formed. She wanted to run, to disappear into the forest forever, but her body refused to move. How could this be happening? Yesterday, she had helped her father repair their leaking roof. Last night, they had shared their meager supper in companionable silence. What sin had she committed to deserve such punishment? The crowd parted suddenly, like a flock of startled birds. The laughter died in throats as a tall figure pushed through. Even Harold straightened, instinctively taking a half step back. The newcomer stood head and shoulders above most men in the village, his broad frame clothed in foreign garb. Scars crisscrossed his exposed forearms, telling tales of distant battles that the villagers could only imagine. His beard was braided in the northern style, and his piercing blue eyes surveyed the scene with cold calculation. A Viking. Even the most foolish drunkard knew better than to continue their mockery. The marketplace fell into a silence so complete that Eileen could hear her own ragged breathing. The stranger's gaze swept over her, not with the leering assessment of the other men, but with something more complex. A recognition that made her skin prickle with unease. How much? The Viking's voice was deep, his accent thick but his meaning clear. He reached for a pouch at his belt, the jingle of coins silencing even the remaining whispers. Harold's eyes widened, darting between the imposing stranger and his daughter. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his features. She is worth a good horse," he stammered, a hint of fear now evident in his voice. The Viking tossed the leather pouch onto the wooden platform. The sound of coins spilling across the rough planks was obscenely loud in the hushed square. "I'll take the girl," he stated, as if commenting on the weather. His hand closed firmly around Eileen's upper arm, not painfully but with undeniable strength. Eileen stood frozen, shock rendering her mute. This couldn't be happening. She was being sold, actually sold, to a foreign warrior whose intentions she couldn't begin to guess. "Father," she finally gasped, finding her voice as the Viking began to pull her away. "Don't do this, please." But Harold was already gathering the scattered coins, his movements hurried and shameful. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something Eileen had never seen before. Fear, yes, but also a strange relief that chilled her more than his betrayal. What could possibly make a father glad to be rid of his only child? As the Viking led her away from the marketplace, through the stunned crowd that parted before them like water, Eileen's mind reeled with unanswered questions. The humiliation of being bartered away was consuming enough, but something darker lurked beneath the surface of this transaction. Something in her father's furtive glances, in the way he'd avoided her eyes until the very end. What no one in the village knew, what Eileen herself could not possibly suspect, was that her father's desperate act concealed a secret that could destroy not just their family, but the entire community. And that secret was about to unravel in ways none of them could foresee. The Viking's grip remained firm as they left the village behind. "My name is Eric," he said quietly, his first words spoken directly to her. "And your father has done you a terrible wrong. But perhaps not in the way you think." The wooden door of the remote cabin creaked shut behind them, sealing Eileen inside with the Viking who had purchased her like livestock. Twilight filtered through the single window, casting long shadows across the dirt floor. Eric moved with the quiet precision of a predator, lighting a small fire in the stone hearth without speaking. The flames illuminated his scarred face, a map of battles survived and blood spilled, yet his blue eyes held something unexpected when they settled on her. Not lust or cruelty, but a guarded watchfulness that left her unbalanced. Eileen pressed her back against the rough wooden wall, her body rigid with fear. Her fingers searched desperately for anything that might serve as a weapon. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice cracking despite her attempt at defiance. The question hung in the air between them, sharp as a blade. Eric regarded her for several long moments, then gestured toward a wooden stool. "Sit," he said, his accent thick yet comprehensible. "You need not fear that kind of harm from me." He turned away, rummaging through a leather satchel as if her compliance was assumed. Eileen didn't move. Men who buy women rarely have honorable intentions. She spat the words, anger temporarily overriding her terror. The memory of her father's betrayal burned fresh, the coins changing hands, the laughter of the villagers, the humiliation that had scorched itself into her very being. The Viking straightened, a piece of dried meat in his hand, which he offered to her. "I did not buy you for the reasons you think." When she made no move to accept the food, he placed it on the small table between them and retreated, giving her space. "Your father," he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow will bring enough troubles of its own." The cryptic statement sent a chill down her spine. What did this stranger know of her father? Of her? She remained standing until hunger finally drove her to the stool, her movements cautious as a cornered animal. The dried meat was tough but flavorful, better than anything she'd eaten in weeks. This small kindness confused her more than cruelty would have. As night deepened outside, Eric spread a blanket on the floor near the door. "You take the bed," he said, nodding toward a straw pallet in the corner. "I sleep here." With that, he stretched his large frame across the threshold, effectively blocking the only exit, she noted bitterly, and closed his eyes. Sleep eluded Elin as she lay rigid on the unfamiliar bed. Her mind raced with questions. Why had her father sold her? What did this Viking want? How could she escape? The weight of uncertainty crushed down upon her chest until each breath became a conscious effort. She studied Eric's profile in the dying firelight. His breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep, yet something about his posture suggested he would wake at the slightest disturbance. In the deepest part of the night, when the fire had dwindled to glowing embers, she heard it. Soft murmurings in a foreign tongue, Norse words rumbled from Eric's throat, his brow furrowed even in sleep. Elin remained perfectly still, eyes barely open, watching through her lashes. The Viking turned restlessly, his massive arm flung outward as if warding off an invisible attacker. "Ikahen is skilled," he muttered, the words punctuated by a sharp intake of breath. Then switching to her language with startling clarity, "She does not deserve her father's burden." Elin's heart hammered against her ribs so violently she feared it might wake him. Her father's burden? What did that mean? A tremor ran through her body as possibilities unfurled in her mind, none of them comforting. She forced herself to breathe slowly, feigning sleep when Eric's eyes suddenly snapped open, alert in an instant as if he'd never been unconscious. He stared at the ceiling for long moments, then sighed heavily before rising silently to add wood to the fire. The flames cast his profile in sharp relief. Not the monster she had expected, but a man haunted by secrets of his own. Eventually, he returned to his makeshift bed, but Elin sensed he remained awake long after, just as she did. Morning came with thin gray light seeping through the window's oiled parchment. Elin had dozed fitfully at best, jerking awake at every creak and rustle. She found Eric already up, a small bundle of belongings gathered by the door. Without ceremony, he handed her a chunk of bread and a strip of dried fish. "We go to the river," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "There are things you must understand." Fear and curiosity warred within her as she followed him outside. The cabin stood at the forest's edge, far from any traveled road. Dense trees surrounded them on three sides, their ancient trunks standing like silent sentinels. The air smelled of pine and earth, so different from the acrid smoke and waste of the village. Under different circumstances, she might have found it peaceful. They walked in silence, Eric several paces ahead, always watching their surroundings with the vigilance of a man accustomed to danger. Elin noted the way he moved, fluid despite his size, each step deliberate. A warrior's walk. She calculated her chances of running, of losing herself in the woods, but something held her back. The mystery of his words in the night pulled at her like an invisible thread. The gurgle of water announced the river before they reached it, a swift, clear current rushing over smooth stones. Without hesitation, Eric knelt at the water's edge and plunged his hands into the icy flow. Only then did Elin notice the blood caked beneath his fingernails and smeared across his palms. "You've killed someone," she whispered, taking an involuntary step backward. "A deer," he replied without looking up, "before dawn." His hands worked methodically, scrubbing away the crimson stains. Food for 3 days. Relief washed through her, followed immediately by confusion. Why had he hunted if they were traveling? Did he intend to keep her here, in this isolated place? The questions crowded her throat, but before she could voice any of them, Eric fixed her with a penetrating stare that rooted her to the spot. "Your father hides secrets larger than your pain," he said, his voice low and measured. "One day, you will have to choose between hating him or saving him." The world seemed to tilt beneath Elin's feet. The words struck with physical force, driving the breath from her lungs. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What secrets? Why would my own father sell me if not from cruelty or desperation?" Eric rose to his full height, water dripping from his cleansed hands. His expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. A decision being made. "Your father is not who you believe him to be," he said carefully. "Nor is he who the village believes him to be." "Then who is he?" Elin challenged, anger suddenly flaring bright and hot within her. "And who are you to know more about my father than his own daughter?" The Viking's gaze never wavered. "I am someone who has walked between worlds, girl. Someone who recognizes when a man acts from fear rather than malice." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Your father did not sell you because he valued you less than a horse. He sold you to the one person who might keep you alive when the truth is revealed." A cold weight settled in the pit of Elin's stomach. The certainty in Eric's voice left no room for doubt, yet his words made no sense. What truth could possibly justify such betrayal? What danger could be great enough to warrant such desperate measures? "I don't believe you," she said, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "My father is a simple farmer. We have nothing, own nothing of value." "Not all treasures are gold and silver," Eric replied enigmatically. "Some are written in blood and sealed with oaths." He turned back toward the cabin, his broad shoulders set with grim purpose. "Come. We cannot linger here. There are eyes in these woods that see more than you know." As Elin followed him reluctantly back through the trees, the morning sunlight seemed to dim. Her father's face swam before her mind's eye, not as he had been in the marketplace, cold and distant, but as she remembered him from childhood, singing softly as he mended tools by the fire, teaching her to read the stars, his laughter rare but genuine. How could that man and the one who had sold her be the same person, and what terrible secret could bridge the gap between them? The question expanded in her chest until it threatened to suffocate her. Whatever burden her father carried, it had now become hers as well. A legacy of mystery and danger she had never asked for and could not escape. Dusk settled over the countryside, painting the sky in deep purples and fading oranges, as Eric led Elin toward a squat stone building nestled at the crossroads. The tavern's weathered sign, a faded image of a crown and dagger, swung lazily in the evening breeze. Even from a distance, the sounds of revelry spilled through its thick walls, raucous laughter, drunken arguments, and the occasional snatch of an off-key ballad. Elin hesitated at the threshold, her stomach knotting with apprehension. "Why are we here?" she whispered, drawing her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. The smell of unwashed bodies and stale beer assaulted her senses, even before Eric pushed open the heavy wooden door. "To listen," he answered simply. "The tongue loosens when the cup fills." His large hand pressed against her lower back, guiding her inside with gentle insistence. The wall of noise hit Elin like a physical force. The tavern was packed to bursting, a churning sea of bodies illuminated by smoky tallow candles and a roaring hearth that cast more shadows than light. The air hung thick with the stench of sweat, spilled ale, and roasting meat, so dense she could almost taste it on her tongue. Men of all stations crowded around rough-hewn tables, soldiers still in partial armor, merchants with fingers stained by coin counting, weather-beaten travelers layered in road dust, and local peasants spending what little copper they had on brief respite from their hardscrabble lives. Eric navigated the crowd with surprising grace for his size, keeping Elin close as he found them a corner table with a partial view of the entire room. He ordered ale and stew with a few clipped words and a flash of silver that ensured prompt service. The barmaid's eyes lingered curiously on Elin before darting away. "Keep your eyes open, your head down, and your ears sharp," Eric murmured, leaning close enough that his beard brushed her shoulder. "But speak to no one." The warning was unnecessary. Elin had no desire to draw attention in this place where she was clearly out of place, a young woman among wolves. She hunched her shoulders, making herself as small as possible while sipping the watered-down ale Eric had pushed toward her. The bitter liquid burned her throat, but she welcomed the warmth spreading through her belly. Snippets of conversation drifted around them, complaints about taxes, boasts of conquests both martial and romantic, gossip about noble families whose names meant nothing to Elin, and the perennial grumbling about poor harvests and harsh lords. None of it seemed worth the risk Eric had taken bringing her here, until a booming laugh from the bar cut through the din. "Another round for my friends," called a heavy-set merchant, his fine clothes stained with food and drink, his cheeks flushed crimson from excess. A celebration of good fortune and clever trades. Several men raised their cups in salute, but the merchant's bleary gaze had already wandered and landed directly on Elin. Recognition dawned in his alcohol-glazed eyes, followed swiftly by malicious delight. "By St. Peter's bones," he crowed, loud enough for half the tavern to hear. "If it isn't the trader's daughter, the girl worth only a horse." The words sliced through the tavern's ambient noise like a blade. Conversations faltered as heads turned, curious eyes seeking out the subject of such mockery. Elin felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her light-headed and cold despite the tavern's oppressive heat. Her fingers clutched the edge of the table so tightly that splinters dug into her flesh. Traitor. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Eric's face remained impassive, but she felt his body tense beside her, coiled like a predator preparing to strike. The merchant, emboldened by alcohol and his audience, staggered a few steps closer. "Tell us, girl," he called, wiping ale from his beard with a grimy sleeve. "Did your father think a single horse a fair trade? Or did he hope for a whole stable before settling?" Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Perhaps he should have thrown in his own mother to sweeten the deal. Elin's throat closed around any response she might have made. The humiliation of the marketplace flooded back, compounded now by this new and terrible accusation. Traitor. Her father, the man who had taught her to always speak truth, to deal fairly with neighbors even when they didn't return the courtesy. A traitor? To whom? How? Before the merchant could continue his taunting, Eric's gaze found him. The Viking made no threatening gesture, spoke no word of warning. He simply looked at the man with such cold, focused intensity that the merchant's next words died on his lips. The laughter around him faltered, then faded entirely as others noticed Eric's silent promise of violence. The merchant's face drained of color almost comically fast. He mumbled something unintelligible, then retreated to the safety of his companions, suddenly fascinated by the bottom of his ale cup. The tavern's noise gradually resumed, attention shifting elsewhere, but the damage was done. Elin felt as if she'd been branded, marked for all to see with her father's alleged crimes. Her hands trembled as she raised her cup, needing something, anything to occupy them. "He called my father a traitor," she whispered, the words barely audible above the tavern's clamor. "What did he mean? Why would anyone say such a thing?" Eric's eyes continued to scan the room, missing nothing. "Not everything is as it appears," he said, his voice low and controlled. "The price your father paid was not merely for land debts. He tried to hide a mistake, but failed." The cryptic answer only kindled more questions in Elin's mind, but before she could press further, the tavern door burst open. 3 armed men entered, not the usual soldiers or local militia, but men whose polished armor and confident bearing spoke of higher rank and purpose. The tavern quieted instantly as they surveyed the room with practiced efficiency. "Time to leave," Eric muttered, rising so smoothly that his chair barely scraped the floor. He tossed additional coins on the table and guided Elin toward the back door with a hand firmly at her elbow. "Who are they?" she whispered, as they slipped past the kitchen, where harried servants dodged one another in the cramped space. Men who ask too many questions, Eric replied grimly, and who would be very interested in the daughter of Harold the farmer. They emerged into the cool night air behind the tavern, where barrels of ale stood stacked alongside piles of firewood. Eric pulled her deeper into the shadows as voices drifted through the open kitchen door. Description matches. Young woman, fair hair, traveling with a northerner. They were here not moments ago. Aylin's blood turned to ice. They were hunting her. Strangers in fine armor were actively searching for a simple farmer's daughter. None of this made sense, yet the danger felt undeniably real. Why? She breathed, panic rising in her chest. Why would anyone care about me? Eric's grip tightened on her arm as he pulled her into the tree line behind the tavern, moving swiftly but silently. Because you are Harold's daughter, he said, his voice barely audible. And that makes you either valuable or dangerous, depending on who finds you first. The implications of his words stole what little breath remained in Aylin's lungs. Her entire life, she had been nothing, a peasant girl in a forgotten corner of the kingdom, invisible to anyone with power or position. The idea that she could be valuable or dangerous to such people seemed absurd, yet here she was, fleeing armed men in the night with a Viking who seemed to know more about her father than she herself did. "What did my father do?" she demanded, digging her heels into the soft earth and refusing to take another step until she received an answer. "Tell me the truth." Eric paused, glancing back toward the tavern where torchlight now flickered as men spilled into the yard to continue their search. His expression was unreadable in the darkness, but she sensed a moment of decision. "Your father made a bargain," he finally said, each word measured carefully. "A bargain that has consequences beyond what he ever imagined. I cannot tell you more until I know we are not overheard." He tugged her forward again. "But know this, the men searching for you do not wish you well. If they find you, they will use you to force your father's hand." The raw certainty in his voice sent a chill down Aylin's spine. Whatever her father had done, whatever secret he carried, it had placed them all in danger, grave enough to warrant this desperate flight. The realization struck her with such force that she stumbled, would have fallen if not for Eric's steadying grip. "But I don't know anything," she whispered, shock giving way to a new kind of fear. "I can't tell them what I don't know." Eric's expression softened momentarily, something like pity flickering in his eyes. "They won't believe that," he said quietly. "And they have ways to make people remember things they never knew." The implication hung between them, terrible in its simplicity. Aylin swallowed hard against the tightness in her throat, suddenly grateful for Eric's presence despite everything. If he had not bought her in the marketplace, if some other fate had befallen her, would she now be in the hands of these searching men, facing whatever ways they had to extract information she didn't possess? As they melted deeper into the forest, guided only by starlight filtering through the canopy, Aylin felt the last vestiges of her old life falling away. The daughter of Harold the farmer was gone, replaced by a fugitive caught in a web of secrets she couldn't begin to untangle. Her heart ached with a peculiar mix of betrayal, fear, and reluctant gratitude toward the Viking who had purchased her like property, yet now risked himself to keep her safe. "We will speak when we are clear," Eric promised, his voice almost gentle despite its urgency. "For now, we must move quickly and leave no trail. Can you do that?" Aylin straightened her shoulders, finding a kernel of determination amid her confusion. Whatever truth awaited her, she would face it standing. "I can," she said simply, and followed him into the darkness. The journey back to the cabin stretched through the darkest hours of night, with only slivers of moonlight penetrating the dense forest canopy to guide their way. Aylin's muscles screamed in protest as she stumbled after Eric, her thin leather shoes offering little protection against the rough terrain. The Viking moved with unsettling silence despite his size, occasionally pausing to listen for pursuers before urging her onward with a gesture. By the time the cabin's shadowy outline appeared through the trees, Aylin was trembling with exhaustion, her mind numb with fear and confusion. "Inside," Eric whispered, scanning the surrounding darkness one final time before following her through the narrow doorway. He barred the door behind them and moved efficiently around the small space, checking the single window's shutters and rekindling the hearth's dying embers with practiced motions. The dancing flames cast his scarred face in stark relief, deepening the shadows beneath his eyes. Elaine collapsed onto the rough-hewn stool, her legs no longer able to support her weight. The word traitor echoed relentlessly in her mind, each repetition a fresh cut. Her father, the quiet, hard-working man who had raised her alone after her mother's death, branded with society's most unforgivable label. The accusation seemed impossible, yet the armed men searching for her lent it terrible credibility. "Rest," Eric said, breaking the silence as he placed a water skin on the table beside her. "You're safe for now." Safe. The word sounded hollow after everything that had happened. Elaine took a reluctant sip of water, then set down the skin with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "I need answers," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice despite her body's betrayal. "No more delays, no more riddles. What has my father done that men hunt his daughter in the night?" Eric held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, a decision made. "First, gather your belongings. We won't stay here beyond dawn." Only then did Elaine notice the small leather sack resting beside the bed, the same bag her father had thrust into her hands just before leading her to the marketplace. In the chaos and trauma of being sold, she'd forgotten its existence entirely. She reached for it now, wondering what meager possessions Harold had deemed important enough to send with his discarded daughter. The bag was lighter than she remembered, containing only a change of clothes, a small carving knife, and a wooden comb that had belonged to her mother. Nothing of value, nothing to explain. Her fingers brushed against something unexpected tucked into a hidden fold of the sack's lining. Parchment. Frowning, Elaine carefully extracted what appeared to be a small folded piece of vellum. The material was finer than any she'd ever touched, its surface smooth beneath her calloused fingertips. Her heart quickened as she unfolded it carefully. The ink had blurred in places, as if touched by water or tears. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, its familiar sharp angles and distinctive flourishes rendered unusually hesitant, as if written in haste or extreme distress. Though parts were illegible, the visible words pierced her heart with the precision of an archer's arrow. "If they discover, all lost. Forgive me, daughter." Elaine stared at the parchment until the letters swam before her eyes. Her hands trembled so violently that the message crackled in protest. "This explains nothing," she whispered, though the evidence of her father's anguish painted his betrayal in a new, confusing light. "Who are they? What could be discovered? Why would he—" Her voice broke, unable to complete the thought. Why would he sell her? Why would he cast her aside like unwanted livestock after raising her with whatever rough tenderness he could manage in their harsh life? Eric moved closer, his expression grave as he studied the parchment over her shoulder. The deep sigh that escaped him seemed to carry the weight of knowledge far beyond what he'd shared. "Now you understand why I brought you away," he said quietly. "There are matters that cannot be spoken of publicly. If this secret falls into the wrong hands, your village would be razed to the ground." The certainty in his voice sent a chill racing down Elaine's spine. Her mind spun between fury at her father and anguish at the thought that some unknown threat hung over not just her, but everyone she had ever known. "You speak in circles," she accused, rising from the stool despite her exhaustion, parchment clutched in her white-knuckled grip. What secret could a simple farmer possibly hold that would endanger an entire village? And how do you know of it when I, his own daughter, am kept in darkness? Eric's weathered face revealed nothing, but something flickered in his pale eyes. A calculation, a measuring of what could be said. "Your father is not merely what he appears to be," he said finally, "nor am I simply a Viking warrior who happened to be passing through your marketplace." Before he could elaborate, a sound outside the cabin froze them both. The snap of a twig, too deliberate to be an animal. Eric's hand flew to his sword as he extinguished the candle with his other, plunging the room into darkness broken only by the hearth's dying glow. He motioned for silence, then moved to the window with the fluid grace of a predator, peering carefully through a crack in the shutters. Elaine's heart hammered against her ribs so violently she feared it might be audible. She clutched the parchment to her chest as if it might shield her from whatever danger lurked outside. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional pop from the fireplace and the blood rushing in her ears. Someone was here, Eric whispered finally, turning back toward her. Recently. They've left tracks outside the door. Fresh fear coursed through Elend's veins like ice water. Had the men from the tavern followed them after all? How had they tracked them through the dark forest without being detected? The questions piled atop the mountain of mysteries already tormenting her, threatening to crush her beneath their weight. "We leave now," Eric said, gathering his few possessions with swift efficiency. "It's not safe to wait for dawn." "But who?" Elend began, only to be silenced by Eric's raised hand. The Viking moved to her side with unsettling quietness for a man of his size, his voice dropping to the barest whisper against her ear. "Listen carefully," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. "What I tell you now must never be repeated where others might hear. Your father made a bargain years ago, one he believed necessary for survival. He provided information about your lord's defenses to men who used it for their own gain. Men who have now returned to collect a greater debt." Elend's breath caught in her throat. Betrayal of one's liege lord was treason of the highest order, punishable by death not just for the traitor, but often for his entire family. The accusation in the tavern had been true. Her father was indeed a traitor, and she carried his blood, his shame, his crime in her very veins. "No," she whispered, the denial automatic even as understanding crystallized in her mind. The way her father had always avoided the local lord's men, his reluctance to attend village gatherings, his insistence that they keep to themselves, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. He couldn't have. "He did," Eric confirmed, his voice neither condemning nor absolving. "And when those he betrayed discovered his identity, he made another choice: to send you away with the one person who might keep you safe from their vengeance." Elend's legs threatened to buckle beneath her. "You," she breathed, pieces clicking into place with nauseating clarity. "You knew. You came to our village specifically for this purpose." Eric nodded once, confirming her suspicion without elaboration. He moved toward the door, checking his sword before gesturing for her to follow. "The full tale must wait," he said. "We've lingered too long already." As Elend stumbled after him into the night, clutching her father's cryptic message, the realization that her entire life had been built upon secrets and lies threatened to overwhelm her. The solid ground of her existence had transformed into shifting sand, leaving nothing certain except the mounting danger surrounding her. The forest enveloped them in its dark embrace, branches clawing at their clothing as they pushed forward with only starlight to guide their way. Each shadow seemed to harbor enemies, each distant sound a potential threat. Elend's mind raced between fragments of memory, her father's distant expression in recent months, his refusal to explain their increasing poverty, the whispers that stopped when she entered rooms. "I've lived with him my entire life," she said suddenly, the words escaping like birds freed from a cage. "How could I not have known?" Eric glanced back at her, his expression softened momentarily by something resembling compassion. "We see what we expect to see," he said simply. "A daughter expects a father, not a traitor with blood on his hands." Blood. The word conjured images Elend's mind refused to fully form. Her gentle, quiet father involved in acts that led to others' deaths. The very possibility made her stomach twist with revulsion. Yet, hadn't she seen those same hands tenderly bandage her childhood wounds, patiently teach her to whittle wood figures, carefully plant each season's crops with reverent hope? How could both versions of Harold exist in one man? And which was the true face behind the mask? As they continued their flight through the forest, Elend realized with hollow certainty that nothing in her life would ever be simple again. Her father's sin had marked her as surely as if it were branded upon her skin, a legacy of betrayal and danger she had inherited without knowledge or consent. The parchment crinkled in her grip, its partial message both explanation and accusation, a fragment of truth in a world suddenly composed entirely of shadows. And somewhere behind them, unknown pursuers searched for the traitor's daughter, carrying with them questions for which she had no answers, and punishment for crimes she had not committed. Dawn broke in pale streaks across the eastern sky as Elin jerked awake from a fitful sleep. For one disorienting moment, she expected to see the familiar rafters of her father's cottage above her. Reality crashed back as her gaze met unfamiliar branches instead, their twisted fingers stretching against the lightening sky. She lay curled against the massive roots of an ancient oak, her body aching from the hard ground and the previous day's flight through the forest. The cabin was far behind them now. After discovering the intruder's tracks, Eric had led her through the darkness for hours, navigating by stars and instinct until exhaustion forced them to stop. They had made camp, if the crude shelter of branches and leaves could be called such, in this small clearing, far from any path or road. Elin pushed herself upright, wincing as stiffened muscles protested the movement. The clearing was empty. Eric was gone. Panic surged through her veins, sharp and immediate. Had he abandoned her, left her alone to face whoever hunted the traitor's daughter? She scrambled to her feet, eyes darting wildly around the small space. Their meager belongings remained undisturbed. Her sack, his sword belt. No, not his sword belt. The realization froze her in place. Eric would never voluntarily part with his weapon. The crunch of approaching footsteps sent her diving back toward the shelter of the tree roots, grabbing a fallen branch as a pathetic approximation of a weapon. She held her breath, knuckles white around the rough wood as the footsteps drew closer. Eric emerged through the trees, moving with his characteristic silent grace despite carrying a brace of rabbits in one hand. Relief flooded Elin's body, immediately followed by embarrassment at her panicked reaction. "You thought I left?" It wasn't a question. Eric's expression remained neutral as he dropped the rabbits beside the cold remains of last night's small fire. Elin lowered the branch, her cheeks burning. "I woke alone," she said, the words sounding petulant even to her own ears. "Your sword was still here. I hunt better with a knife." He gestured toward the rabbits, already skinned and cleaned. The sword would have worn the game. The practical explanation only deepened Elin's embarrassment. Of course he wouldn't leave his weapons behind if abandoning her. She was thinking like a frightened child, not a survivor. As Eric rekindled the fire with practiced efficiency, Elin studied the clearing in daylight. Thin morning mist curled around the trees, transforming the mundane forest into something ethereal and strange. Birds called in the distance, but their songs seemed muted, as if the very woods held its breath around them. "Where are we?" she asked, kneeling beside the growing flames and extending her chilled hands toward their warmth. "Far enough from the cabin to be safe for now." Eric skewered the rabbits on sharpened sticks and positioned them over the fire, but not far enough from those who search. The reminder of their pursuers settled like a stone in Elin's stomach. "The doors of the cabin," she recalled suddenly. "They were unlocked when we returned." Eric's eyes met hers across the flames, approval flickering briefly in their depths. "Yes. Someone was inside while we were at the tavern," she continued, the realization unfolding like a terrible flower. "They knew where to find us." "How?" Instead of answering directly, Eric produced a small pouch from within his tunic and tossed it to her. It landed with a soft thud in her lap. Hesitantly, Elin opened it, revealing a handful of small objects that resembled dried berries or seeds. "Trackers," Eric explained, turning the rabbits to cook their other side, pressed into the mud outside the cabin door. "I found them last night before we fled." Elin stared at the innocuous-looking objects. "I don't understand." "They're trained." Eric's expression darkened. "Some hunt with dogs, others with hawks. The truly dangerous hunt with men who can read the land as easily as you might read tracks in fresh snow. They can follow these?" Elin held up the pouch, her throat suddenly dry. Eric nodded grimly. "A skilled tracker can follow a trail days old, across rivers and stone. These," he gestured toward the pouch, "only make their task easier." Cold fear trickled down Elin's spine. She had grown up in these forests, learned their rhythms and secrets alongside her father, yet she had never imagined them harboring such dangers. The woods she'd once considered a sanctuary now felt like a trap slowly closing around them. They already know you exist, Eric continued, his voice low and measured. Your father's attempt to hide you failed the moment those men saw you in the marketplace. The reminder of her father's betrayal stung afresh. Elin clutched the pouch tighter, her nails digging into her palm through the rough fabric. You still haven't told me everything, she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. Who exactly is hunting us? What did my father do beyond selling information? And why are you, a foreigner, involved at all? Eric's gaze remained on the cooking meat, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle tensing that suggested internal conflict. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen. Your father made a pact, he said, with men who promised protection and gold in exchange for knowledge of your lord's defenses and movements, information that allowed raids on caravans and outlying farms. Elin felt the blood drain from her face. He helped raiders, thieves, warriors from across the northern sea, Eric corrected, his accent thickening slightly. My people. The revelation struck Elin like a physical blow. Your people, she repeated numbly. My father betrayed his lord to 2 Vikings. Eric met her accusation unflinchingly. 5 years ago, during the Great Famine, your crops had failed for the 3rd season. Your lord offered no aid, took his taxes in what little livestock remained. Your father had a choice: watch you starve or make a deal. The memory of that terrible time rose unbidden in Elin's mind. The gnawing emptiness in her belly, the crying children in the village, the desperate prayers that went unanswered. They had survived when others hadn't. Their table never abundant, but never entirely bare. She had believed it was her father's skill as a hunter and trapper that had saved them. Another lie to add to the mountain between them. But if he dealt with your people, Elin said slowly, piecing together the fragments of truth, why would he sell me to you? Why not simply send me north with your raiders? Because the Northern Alliance fractured, Eric replied, his expression grim. Some wanted more than information. They wanted land, settlements. Your father refused to help with their larger ambitions, so they threatened to reveal his role to your lord. When they returned this season, they came not as allies but as blackmailers. Understanding dawned, cruel and clarifying. They threatened me, Elin whispered. To control him. Eric nodded once, removing the rabbits from the fire. Your father knew they would use you as leverage. His only choice was to get you away before they could take you themselves. So he sold me publicly. Elin continued, the pieces fitting together with sickening logic. To make it appear he didn't care about me. To make me worthless as a hostage. And to place you with someone who understood the true danger. Eric tore a portion of meat from one rabbit and offered it to her. Someone who owed him a debt. Elin accepted the food mechanically, her appetite gone despite not having eaten since the previous day. What debt could a Viking warrior possibly owe to a traitorous farmer? Something flickered across Eric's face, a shadow of memory quickly suppressed. That is a tale for another time, he said, turning his attention to his own meal. For now, know only that I am honor-bound to protect you. The conversation lapsed into silence, broken only by the crackling fire and distant birdsong. Elin forced herself to eat, despite the meat tasting like ashes in her mouth. Each bite nourished a body she now understood was being hunted, not just by Eric's people but potentially by her own lord's men, should her father's treason be discovered. They're coming, aren't they? She finally asked, the question that had been building since discovering the tracked cabin. Right now. Following those seeds. Yes, Eric answered simply, not bothering with false comfort. Then we can't stay. Elin rose to her feet, newfound determination pushing aside her exhaustion and confusion. Whatever her father had done, whatever complications lay between them, she refused to be captured by men who would use her as a pawn in their power games. Eric studied her for a long moment, something like approval glinting in his eyes. No. He agreed, kicking dirt over the fire. We cannot. As they gathered their few possessions in tense silence, Elin's mind raced with questions still unanswered. What was the debt Eric spoke of? How had her father, a simple farmer, become entangled with Viking raiders? And most urgently, where could they possibly go that skilled trackers couldn't follow? The forest around them seemed suddenly alive with unseen threats, each rustling leaf potentially concealing an enemy, each snapping twig announcing their presence to pursuers. Elin glanced at the pouch of tracker seeds still clutched in her hand and fought back the rising tide of panic threatening to overwhelm her. "If you know these woods," Eric said, buckling on his sword belt, "now is the time to use that knowledge. Where would a hunter go to lose those who follow?" The question stirred something in Elin, a memory of her father teaching her to evade the Lord's foresters when they hunted in forbidden territory. "Water," she said, certainty strengthening her voice. "A fast-running stream that flows north toward the mountains. The current will wash away our scent and any trail we leave." Eric nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Then lead, daughter of Harold. Show me your father's craft." As Elin stepped into the tree line, orienting herself by the rising sun, she felt a strange mixture of fear and resolve crystallizing within her. She might be the trader's daughter, hunted and betrayed, but she was also a survivor, and for now, at least, that would have to be enough. The village of Ravenhill appeared before them as the afternoon sun began its descent, its cluster of thatched roofs and timber buildings nestled in a shallow valley. From their vantage point on the forested ridge, Elin and Eric watched the settlement's activity with wary eyes. Unlike Elin's home village, with its scattered dwellings and central marketplace, Ravenhill was built tight around a stone church and enclosed by a crude wooden palisade. Meager protection against raiders, but enough to mark the boundary between safety and wilderness. "We shouldn't be here," Elin whispered, instinctively shrinking back into the cover of the trees. After 3 days of traveling cross-country, following streams and keeping to rocky terrain to confound their pursuers, the sight of human habitation filled her with equal parts longing and dread. "They'll recognize me." Eric studied the village gate where 2 bored-looking men stood guard with spears. "Not your people," he said. "Different lord's land. We crossed the boundary marker yesterday." Elin blinked in surprise. She had been so focused on evading trackers, on placing one foot before the other despite exhaustion and hunger, that she hadn't realized how far they had traveled. But still, news spreads, merchants talk. "We need information more than we need invisibility," Eric replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And you need real shelter, if only for one night." Looking down at herself, Elin couldn't disagree with his assessment. Her dress was torn and mud-stained, her hair a tangled nest, her skin scratched by branches and bitten by insects. 3 nights of sleeping on forest ground had left her aching in places she hadn't known could ache. Even the prospect of a roof and a corner of straw to sleep on seemed like unimaginable luxury. "Follow my lead," Eric instructed, standing to his full height. "You are my sister's child, recently orphaned. I am taking you north to family. Speak as little as possible." Before Elin could protest the flimsy cover story, Eric was already moving down the hill toward the village gate with the confident stride of a man who expected no challenge. She hurried after him, heart hammering against her ribs as they approached the guards. The men straightened as they drew near, eyeing Eric's foreign appearance and warriors bearing with obvious suspicion. The older guard stepped forward, his spear not quite leveled but positioned to be ready if needed. "What business brings a Northman to Ravenhill?" he demanded, gaze flickering between Eric and Elin. "Passage and a night's rest," Eric answered smoothly, his accent deliberately thickened. "My sister's child needs shelter. We journey to meet our kin." The guard's eyes narrowed as he scrutinized Elin, taking in her disheveled appearance. "Orphaned, is she?" "Fever took her mother," Eric said with practiced solemnity. "No family remains in the south." A lie built upon a lie, Elin thought, keeping her gaze downcast as she'd seen village orphans do when seeking charity. How easily falsehoods flowed now, becoming her new reality. Just days ago, she would have balked at even the smallest deception. Now she found herself silently crafting embellishments to Eric's story should the guard press further. After a tense moment, the guard stepped aside with a grunt. "Inns by the church. Keep your business peaceful, Northman, or answer to Lord Aldrich's justice." Eric nodded his acknowledgement, placing a protective hand on Elend's shoulder as they passed through the gate. The gesture was meant for show, but Elend found herself grateful for its steady pressure as they entered the bustle of village life. The first human settlement she'd seen since being sold from her own. Ravenhill hummed with late afternoon activity. Women gathered at the central well, balancing water jugs while exchanging gossip. Children chased chickens between houses, their shrieks of laughter a jarring reminder of normalcy. Men returned from fields with tools slung over their shoulders, nodding greetings to neighbors. It was a scene of ordinary life so similar to Elend's home that her throat tightened with unexpected grief. They made their way toward the two-story timber building that served as the village inn, its weathered sign depicting a crude black bird with wings spread. Inside, the common room was already half full despite the early hour, filled with the mingled scents of ale, sweat, and smoking meat. Conversations faltered briefly as the strangers entered, curious eyes assessing before returning to their own concerns. Eric secured them a corner table with a few copper coins and ordered food and ale from a harried serving girl. When she departed, he leaned closer to Elend, voice pitched low beneath the room's ambient noise. "Listen more than you speak," he instructed. "Villages like this are crossroads for news and rumor. We need to know if word has spread about Harold." The mention of her father's name sent a fresh wave of confusion through Elend. 3 days of flight had exhausted her body but done nothing to resolve the tumult of her emotions. Anger at his betrayal warred with worry for his fate, both complicated by the growing suspicion that she had never truly known him at all. Their food arrived, a wooden trencher bearing chunks of salt pork, coarse bread, and a thick pottage of barley and root vegetables. Elend fell upon it with embarrassing eagerness, her body's hunger overriding any attempt at decorum. Eric ate more slowly, his attention divided between their meal and the conversations flowing around them. As the evening deepened and more villagers filed into the inn, the volume rose accordingly. Men traded complaints about crops and taxes, women discussed ailments and remedies, travelers shared news from neighboring settlements. Elend found herself lulled by the ordinary rhythm of it all, the familiar cadence of rural life continuing as if her world hadn't shattered days before. Until a name caught her attention, slicing through her momentary comfort like a blade. "Traitor to be judged publicly, from what I hear." Elend's hand froze midway to her mouth, bread forgotten as she strained to hear the conversation happening 3 tables away. A merchant in travel-stained clothes was holding court among local farmers, his voice carrying with the practiced projection of a man accustomed to being the center of attention. "Lord Rothwell himself ordered it," the merchant continued, clearly enjoying his audience's rapt expressions. "A full tribunal on the village green, where all can witness justice served." "What manner of treason?" asked one of the farmers, leaning forward eagerly. The merchant took a long drink from his cup, deliberately drawing out the moment. "The very worst kind," he said finally, lowering his voice theatrically so that his listeners leaned closer still. "Selling information to northern raiders, betraying his own people for Viking silver." Elend's blood turned to ice in her veins. The pottage she had eaten threatened to rise back up her throat as whispers erupted around the merchant's table. "They say he sold his own daughter too," added another man, a traitor by his garb, newly arrived and eager to contribute to the scandalous tale. "Offered her in the marketplace like livestock, trying to flee before his crimes were discovered." A chorus of disgusted exclamations followed this revelation. Elend felt Eric's hand close around her wrist beneath the table, a silent warning not to react. She couldn't have moved if she'd wanted to, her body frozen in horror as strangers discussed her shame as casual entertainment. "When is this judgment to take place?" someone asked. 3 days hence," replied the merchant. "Lord Rothwell wants time for word to spread, for people from all surrounding villages to witness. A lesson to any who might consider such treachery." "And the daughter?" questioned a woman's voice. "What's become of her?" The merchant shrugged expansively. "Taken by a Northman, from what I hear. Perhaps an accomplice, perhaps just opportunistic. Lord's men are searching for her as well. There's talk she knew of her father's crimes, may even have assisted." Muttered condemnations rippled through the listeners. Traitor's daughter, accomplice, enemy to her own people. Eileen's vision narrowed to a tunnel, the room's edges blurring as panic clawed at her chest. Her father, captured, awaiting public judgment. Herself, hunted, already condemned by rumor and assumption. The nightmare that had begun in the marketplace was spreading outward like poison through water, tainting everything it touched. "We need to leave," she whispered, the words barely audible even to herself. Eric's expression remained impassive, but his eyes conveyed understanding. "Finish your meal," he murmured. "We depart without hurry." Any sudden movement draws eyes. With trembling hands, Eileen forced herself to continue eating, each bite like ash in her mouth. The merchant's voice droned on, embellishing his tale with imagined details that twisted the knife of her reality. She wanted to scream denials, to defend the father she had known, or thought she had known, against these strangers' contempt. Yet what defense could she offer when the core accusation was apparently true? As darkness fell outside and the inn grew more crowded, Eric finally stood, gesturing for Eileen to follow. They made their way upstairs to the small chamber he had rented, a luxury that now seemed a dangerous extravagance. The moment the door closed behind them, Eileen's composure shattered. 3 days, she gasped, pressing her fists against her mouth to stifle the sound. "They're going to judge him in 3 days. Execute him, most likely." Eric moved to the room's single window, checking the shutters before responding. "Yes." "We have to do something," Eileen insisted, pacing the narrow confines of the chamber. "I can't just hide in the forest while he—" "You can," Eric interrupted, his voice gentle despite the firmness of his words. "And you must, if you wish to survive." "Survive for what?" Eileen demanded, unexpected anger surging through her grief. "To live as a fugitive, the trader's daughter, hunted and hated for something I knew nothing about." Eric studied her, his scarred face unreadable in the room's dim light. "Or to learn the full truth," he said finally. "To understand why your father made the choices he did. To decide for yourself whether he deserves your hatred or your forgiveness." The words struck Eileen like physical blows, each one landing with devastating precision. The truth. Despite everything she had learned, she knew instinctively that pieces were still missing, fragments of the puzzle that might transform the entire picture if only she could find them. 3 days, she repeated, the anger draining from her voice, replaced by a strange, hollow determination. 3 days to reach him before they— She couldn't finish the sentence, the prospect too terrible to voice. Eric didn't offer false comfort or empty reassurances. Instead, he simply asked, "What would you have us do?" The question hung between them, weighted with impossible choices. To attempt rescue would mean facing not just the Lord's justice but the collective judgment of her entire community. To remain hidden would mean abandoning her father to a fate she couldn't bear to contemplate. There were no good options, no clear path through the brambles that had sprung up around her life. "I need to hear it from him," Eileen said finally, the decision crystallizing even as she spoke it. "The whole truth. Before they take him from this world, I need to look in his eyes and understand why." Eric nodded once, respect evident in his expression despite the gravity of her words. "Then we ride at first light," he said. "Toward judgment, not away from it." The sky hung heavy with storm clouds as Eileen and Eric approached the outskirts of her home village. They had traveled hard for 2 days, abandoning caution for speed, pushing themselves to exhaustion and beyond. 2 horses, purchased with most of Eric's remaining silver, had carried them across terrain that would have taken twice as long on foot, their hooves eating away the miles between judgment and redemption. Now, crouched in the shelter of a dense thicket overlooking the village green, Eileen felt her heart stutter at the sight before her. The familiar landscape of her childhood had transformed into something grotesque and ceremonial. A wooden platform stood erected in the center of the green where children had once played and markets had been held. Around it, grim-faced soldiers in Lord Rothwell's colors maintained a perimeter, pikes gleaming dully in the muted afternoon light. Villagers gathered in clusters, their expressions a mixture of morbid fascination and genuine distress. These were people Eileen had known her entire life. Widow Marta, who had taught her to spin wool, Thomas the blacksmith, who had crafted her small knife as a name-day gift, children she had played with as they all grew from toddlers to youth. Now they assembled to witness her father's judgment, their loyalties divided between a man they had lived alongside for decades and the Lord whose protection they depended upon. "There," Eric murmured, pointing toward a squat stone building adjacent to the green, the village's modest jail, normally used only to house drunks until they sobered or petty thieves awaiting minor punishment. "They will bring him from there when the Lord arrives." As if summoned by the Vikings' words, a commotion arose at the village's main road. A small procession appeared, 4 mounted soldiers flanking an ornate carriage, the Rothwell banner fluttering above. Lord Rothwell himself rarely visited the outlying villages of his domain, preferring the comfort of his keep to the dusty reality of the peasant's existence. That he came in person for this judgment spoke volumes about the severity of Harold's alleged crimes. "We're too late for any rescue," Eric observed quietly. "The entire household guard accompanies him." Elin barely heard the words, her attention fixed on the jail's heavy wooden door as it swung open. 2 guards emerged, dragging between them a figure so changed that for one terrible moment, Elin didn't recognize her own father. Harold the farmer, once tall and broad-shouldered despite his hard life, his beard neatly trimmed, his bearing quietly dignified, had become a hunched, diminished shadow. His clothes hung in tatters from his frame, his beard matted with what appeared to be dried blood. One eye was swollen shut, his lips split and crusted. The guards half carried him toward the platform, his feet barely supporting his weight as they moved. A sound escaped Elin's throat, part gasp, part animal moan of distress. Eric's hand clamped immediately over her mouth, his other arm like iron around her shoulders, preventing her from surging forward in instinctive response to her father's suffering. "Not yet," he hissed in her ear, his voice barely audible over the blood rushing in her head. "They will kill you both if you reveal yourself now. Wait." Struggle as she might against his grip, Elin knew he was right. The rational part of her mind, the part not screaming at the sight of her father's broken body, recognized the futility of charging into a square full of armed soldiers. She forced herself to stillness, though every fiber of her being strained toward the man being secured to a post atop the platform. Lord Rothwell emerged from his carriage, a corpulent man with a florid face, adorned in finery that cost more than most villagers would see in a lifetime. He ascended the platform with the labored dignity of the chronically overfed, positioning himself before the assembled crowd with practiced authority. A thin man in clerical robes followed, carrying a scroll which he unrolled with ceremonious gravity. "Harold, son of Gunther," the clerk began, his reedy voice carrying across the suddenly silent green. "You stand accused of high treason against Lord Rothwell and the Crown. Evidence has been presented that you provided information about guard movements and defense weaknesses to northern raiders, resulting in the loss of valuable goods and the deaths of 7 loyal men." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. 7 deaths. Elin felt the weight of those lives press upon her chest like stones. Had her father truly facilitated murder? Had their survival during the famine years been purchased with other families' grief? "Furthermore," continued the clerk, "you are accused of accepting payment in silver for these betrayals, enriching yourself through the suffering of your rightful lord's people." More whispers, harsher now. Even from a distance, Elin could see faces turning cold with judgment, former neighbors transforming into a jury already convinced of guilt. "How do you answer these charges?" demanded Lord Rothwell directly, dispensing with the formality of having the clerk continue. Harold raised his head with obvious effort. His voice, when it finally came, was a ragged shadow of the strong, quiet tone Elin remembered from her childhood. "I do not deny," he began, pausing to draw a labored breath, "that I provided information to Northmen during the Great Famine." The admission sent a shockwave through the crowd. Confirmation from the accused's own lips transformed suspicion into certainty, rumor into fact. Elin felt herself trembling beneath Eric's restraining arm, tears burning trails down her dirt-smudged cheeks. "I did so," Harold continued, his damaged voice strengthening slightly, "when Lord Rothwell's tax collectors took our last cow and half our grain stores, though children were already dying of hunger in the village. An uncomfortable shifting rippled through some of the villagers. They remembered that terrible time as well as Elin did, the hollow eyes of starving children, the desperation that had driven some to eat bark and rats, the graves dug for those who hadn't survived. "Irrelevant," bellowed Lord Rothwell, his jowls quivering with indignation. "Famine affects all. Taxes are the law. Treason is unforgivable under any circumstance." "I accepted silver," Harold acknowledged, speaking not to the Lord but directly to the assembled villagers. "And with it purchased grain from across the border. Grain I shared with 5 families whose children would have otherwise perished." Elin's breath caught in her throat. She remembered the mysterious appearance of food during the worst months, her father attributing it to successful hunting trips or fortunate trades. She had never questioned how a simple farmer had managed to feed not only his own daughter, but also the widowed Marta's 3 young children, and the twins born to the carpenter's wife during the height of the famine. Several faces in the crowd had softened slightly at Harold's words. Lord Rothwell, noting this dangerous shift, stepped forward with fury etched into his features. "You stand here confessed of treason, attempting to justify the deaths of loyal men with tales of charity. The penalty is death, to be carried out immediately as an example to all who might consider such betrayal." "No." The cry tore from Elin's lips before Eric could stop her, though thankfully it was lost in the general murmur that arose from the crowd at the Lord's pronouncement. Some seemed to approve of the harsh sentence. Others appeared troubled by the lack of a proper trial. None, however, dared openly contradict their lord. Eric's grip on Elin tightened. "There's nothing we can do," he whispered harshly. "Not against so many armed men." "I have to speak with him," Elin insisted, her voice breaking. I have to know the whole truth." "Listen," Eric urged, nodding toward the platform where Harold had straightened as much as his bonds would allow, seeming to gather the last remnants of his strength. "My lord," Harold called, his voice carrying across the now silent green. "Before you carry out your justice, I would speak of one final matter." Lord Rothwell hesitated, then gave a dismissive wave of his bejeweled hand. "Speak then, traitor, though no words will change your fate." Harold's gaze swept the crowd, as if searching for a face he didn't expect to find. "I sold my daughter," he said simply, "to protect her from those who would use her against me." The blunt admission caused another ripple of murmurs. Elin felt Eric tense beside her, his attention suddenly hyper-alert. "The Northmen who once paid me for information returned this season," Harold continued, each word seemingly dragged from the depths of his being. "But they wanted more. Settlements, permanent footholds in these lands. When I refused, they threatened to reveal my past actions to you, my lord. And they promised to take my daughter as insurance that I would comply with their new demands." Understanding washed over Elin in a devastating wave. The marketplace, the humiliation, the cold dismissal, all of it a desperate attempt to hide her, to remove her from danger. She had interpreted her father's actions as the ultimate betrayal when they had been, in his own broken way, an act of protection. "So I did what I must," Harold finished, his voice growing fainter. "I publicly severed ties with the only person I love in this world, making her worthless as leverage. I placed her with the one Northman I knew I could trust, a man who owes me a life debt from years past, a man of honor despite his origins." Eric drew in a sharp breath beside her. Elin turned to him, questions flooding her mind, but his attention remained fixed on Harold. "And now," her father concluded, raising his battered face to the darkening sky, "I face your justice with a clear conscience, my lord. My daughter is beyond your reach and theirs. Take my life if you must, but know that I would make the same choice again to save her from becoming a pawn in games played by powerful men." Tears flowed freely down Elin's face now, hot and relentless. The father she had cursed, whose betrayal had burned like acid in her heart, had sacrificed everything: his reputation, his standing in the community, and now his life, to protect her. The realization was almost too enormous to comprehend, too painful to fully absorb. "A touching tale," Lord Rothwell sneered, unmoved by Harold's confession, "but one that changes nothing. Treason remains treason, whatever its supposed justification." He turned to the captain of his guard. Prepare the execution." As soldiers moved forward with grim purpose, Elin surged against Eric's restraining arm. "We have to do something," she pleaded, her voice raw with desperation. "He did it for me. All of it. For me." Eric's face was a mask of conflicted emotion as he looked from Harold's defeated form to Elin's tear-streaked face. "Your father made his choice," he said finally, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. "He chose your life over his. Would you undo that sacrifice by throwing yourself onto the same pyre?" The truth of his words cut through her panic like a cold blade. Harold had endured torture, humiliation, and now faced death, all to keep her safe. To reveal herself now would render his suffering meaningless, his sacrifice in vain. As the soldiers positioned Harold for execution, Elin made the hardest choice of her young life. She turned her face into Eric's shoulder, unable to watch but unwilling to dishonor her father's sacrifice by looking away from the consequences of her own existence. "Forgive me, Father," she whispered into the rough fabric of Eric's tunic. "And thank you." Thunder rumbled across the sky, drawing every eye upward as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Some in the crowd crossed themselves, murmuring about divine judgment, while Lord Rothwell merely scowled at the inconvenient timing. The executioner stood ready, axe gleaming dully in the storm-darkened afternoon, unmoved by either the weather or the condemned man's confession. Elin trembled against Eric's chest, every muscle in her body screaming to run forward, to stop what was about to happen, to trade her life for her father's. Only Eric's iron grip and the terrible knowledge that such action would render her father's sacrifice meaningless kept her rooted to the spot, hidden among the dense foliage. Then, as if the heavens themselves had chosen to intervene, chaos erupted at the far edge of the village green. "Raiders!" came the panicked cry from a sentry posted at the village's western approach. "Northern raiders approach!" The crowd scattered like startled birds, women grabbing children, men reaching for whatever implements might serve as weapons. Lord Rothwell's guards closed ranks around their master, momentarily abandoning Harold in favor of protecting their lord from the greater threat. Soldiers shouted commands, villagers screamed in terror, and through it all, the rain began to fall in earnest, as if nature itself sought to wash away the blood about to be spilled. Eric's grip on Elin suddenly loosened. "Fate offers a chance," he muttered, eyes scanning the chaotic scene with tactical precision. "But we must move now." Before she could fully comprehend his intent, Eric was dragging her along the tree line, circling toward the rear of the platform, where her father remained bound and momentarily forgotten in the confusion. They moved like shadows through the increasing downpour, the rain providing a curtain of concealment as villagers fled and soldiers organized a hasty defense. "When we reach him, you cut his bonds," Eric instructed, pressing a small knife into her palm. "I will hold off any who notice. Then all three of us run for the horses, understand?" Elin nodded, clutching the blade with white-knuckled determination. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such force she feared it might burst from her chest entirely. This was madness, a desperate gamble with all their lives hanging in the balance. Yet what choice remained? To watch her father die, knowing she might have acted? They reached the rear of the platform as the first clash of weapons rang out from the village's western edge. Eric boosted Elin up with his hands, the wooden structure slick with rain beneath her scrambling fingers. She hauled herself onto the platform, staying low and crawling toward her father, who remained slumped against the post where they had bound him. "Father," she whispered, reaching his side and working frantically at the ropes with Eric's knife. "Father, it's me." Harold's one good eye widened in shock and horror as he recognized her. "Elin, no, you can't be here. You must go." "Not without you," she insisted, sawing desperately at the thick ropes. "I know everything now. I understand what you did." Blood and rainwater mixed on Harold's battered face, making it impossible to tell if he was also weeping. "Foolish girl," he gasped, voice breaking. "I sold you to save you, not so you could throw your life away on mine." The ropes finally gave way beneath the knife's edge. Harold slumped forward, his weakened legs barely supporting his weight. Elin caught him around the waist, staggering under the burden as she tried to guide him toward the platform's edge where Eric waited. "Halt!" The commanding voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. Elin turned to find a soldier standing at the platform's steps, sword drawn and pointed directly at them. By order of Lord Rothwell, the prisoner goes nowhere. Time seemed to freeze in that terrible moment. The soldier's determined face, her father's broken body heavy against her side, the rain pelting down upon them all with indifferent fury. Elin felt a strange calm descend over her, a clarity of purpose crystallizing through her fear. "You know me, Thomas," she said, recognizing the soldier as a boy she had grown up alongside, now a man in Lord Rothwell's service. "You know my father. Is this justice? Taking a man's life for feeding his child and his neighbors when your lord left us to starve?" Uncertainty flickered across Thomas's features, his sword wavering slightly. "He committed treason, Elin. People died. And more will die today if these raiders breach the village," she countered, taking a careful step toward the platform's edge. "Will you waste your sword on a broken man and his daughter when your people need protection?" The clash of battle grew louder from the village perimeter. Shouts and screams mingled with the thunder overhead. Thomas glanced toward the sounds, his duty clearly pulling him in two directions. "Please," Elin whispered, no longer arguing but simply asking, human to human, "let us go." For one breathless moment, Thomas remained frozen in indecision. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he lowered his sword and turned away, hurrying toward the sounds of battle without looking back. "Go!" Eric hissed from below, arms outstretched to help lower Harold down. "Now, before others notice." Together they managed to get Harold off the platform, though he cried out in pain when his feet touched the ground. Whatever had been done to him during his imprisonment had left lasting damage. Eric slung the older man's arm across his shoulders, taking most of his weight as they staggered toward the forest's edge where their horses waited. They had almost reached the tree line when a roared command froze them in their tracks. "Seize them!" Lord Rothwell's voice carried even through the downpour, his bulky figure visible through the rain as he pointed directly at the escaping trio. 50 silver pieces to the man who brings me the traitor's head." 3 soldiers broke away from the defensive line, charging toward them with weapons drawn. Eric gently but firmly pushed Harold toward Elin. "Get him to the horses," he ordered, drawing his sword with the fluid grace of a born warrior. "I will hold them off." "Eric, no," Elin began, but the Viking was already striding forward to meet the oncoming soldiers, his massive frame somehow larger in battle stance, his weapon an extension of his arm rather than a separate tool. "Go," he roared, not looking back as the first soldier reached him. Elin dragged her father forward as best she could, his broken body a dead weight against her straining muscles. Behind them came the clash of steel on steel, grunts of exertion, a cry of pain that she prayed wasn't Eric's. The horses were just ahead, tethered and nervous in the storm, stamping their hooves and tossing their heads at the sounds of battle. "Leave me," Harold gasped as they reached the animals. "Save yourself. It's what I wanted all along." "No," Elin said simply, gathering every ounce of her remaining strength to help boost her father onto the smaller of the 2 horses. "I won't lose you twice." Once Harold was somehow secured on the horse, clinging weakly to its mane, Elin turned back toward the battle. Through the curtain of rain, she could make out Eric fighting against 2 soldiers, the third already down and unmoving on the sodden ground. The Viking moved with shocking speed for his size, his sword a blur of lethal precision, yet even he couldn't hold off trained soldiers forever. Without thinking, Elin grabbed a fallen branch thick as her arm and charged back toward the fight with a cry of defiance tearing from her throat. She swung the makeshift club with all her strength, catching one soldier across the back of his head as he lunged at Eric. The man crumpled without a sound, leaving Eric to dispatch his final opponent with a brutal efficiency that left Elin breathless. "I told you to go," Eric growled, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, mixing with the rain running down his face. "And leave the man who saved my father? Who saved me?" Elin challenged, her voice stronger than she felt. "We go together or not at all." Something flickered across Eric's face. Surprise, perhaps, or a grudging respect. With a curt nod, he wiped blood from his eyes and ran with her back to the horses. In one fluid motion, he mounted the larger animal and extended a hand to pull Elin up behind him. "Hold tight to your father," he instructed as she settled herself. "The road ahead is long and dangerous." They rode hard through the forest, the sounds of battle fading behind them as the horses picked their way through the tangled undergrowth. Harold slumped unconscious against the horse's neck, secured only by Elin's desperate grip on his tunic. Rain lashed at their faces, branches whipped at their bodies, but still they pushed forward, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Lord Rothwell's vengeance. Only when the forest began to thin, giving way to open moorland beyond, did Eric finally slow their pace to spare the laboring horses. They found shelter beneath an ancient oak whose massive canopy offered some protection from the relentless downpour. Elin carefully helped her father down, cradling his head in her lap as Eric checked the severity of his injuries. "He lives," the Viking pronounced finally, though barely. "He needs rest, clean water, and proper care." "Will he survive the journey?" Elin asked, gently brushing matted hair from her father's forehead. "What journey?" Eric looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "Wherever we must go to be safe," she replied, suddenly uncertain. "You said the road ahead is long." Eric's expression softened slightly, something like respect glinting in his pale eyes. "You chose to save him, knowing what he had done, knowing the price that would be paid." "He is my father," Elin said simply. "He sold me to save me. How could I do any less for him? With that choice, you have gained something greater than freedom from his shame," Eric said, resting a calloused hand briefly on her shoulder. "You have found dignity that cannot be bought, nor sold, nor traded." Tears welled in Elin's eyes, mingling with the rain still dripping from her hair. In the span of a week, she had lost everything she had ever known: her home, her safety, her place in the world. Yet somehow, through the crucible of betrayal and revelation, she had found something she hadn't known was missing: her own strength, forged in the fire of impossible choices. Harold stirred slightly, his damaged lips forming words too faint to hear. Elin leaned closer, her ear nearly touching his mouth to catch the whispered plea. "Forgive me," he breathed, his one good eye opening to fix upon her face with desperate intensity. "Forgive me, daughter." The weight of those simple words pressed upon Elin's heart, heavier than the burden of his broken body, more significant than the danger still pursuing them. In them lay the acknowledgement of all he had done, both the sin and the sacrifice, offered up for her judgment alone. "There is nothing to forgive," she whispered back, holding his gaze steadily despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "You gave everything to protect me. Now let me protect you." Eric watched this exchange in respectful silence, his warrior's face softening into something almost gentle. When Harold closed his eye again, slipping back into exhausted unconsciousness, the Viking spoke quietly. "The village will never see either of you the same way again," he said. "The weight of your father's choices, and yours, will mark you both forever in their eyes." Elin nodded, accepting this truth without flinching. "Then we will build a new life elsewhere," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. Not as the trader and the girl traded for a horse, but as people who understand that sometimes the greatest courage lies in bearing a burden, so others might be spared. The rain began to ease, thin shafts of late afternoon sunlight piercing the clouds to dapple the sodden ground around them. Eric gazed at the breaking storm, then back at the young woman cradling her broken father with fierce protectiveness. "Today you proved that dignity cannot be purchased," he said, "nor traded away. It can only be found in the choices we make when facing impossible odds." Elin met his gaze steadily, no longer the terrified girl from the marketplace, but a woman who had stared into the abyss of loss and found herself strong enough to bear it. "Then let us make choices worthy of the price we've paid," she said simply. And in that moment, beneath the ancient oak with the storm slowly passing overhead, three broken people began to forge a new path forward, not unmarked by their pasts, but no longer defined by them either. As Elin's story comes to a close, we're left to wonder, what would we have done in her place? When betrayal cuts deepest from those we love most, do we have the courage to look beyond our pain and see the desperate choices made to protect us? Sometimes what appears as the ultimate rejection may actually be the greatest sacrifice a parent can make. In this medieval tale of impossible choices, we've witnessed how dignity cannot be bought or sold. It lives in our decisions when facing our darkest moments. Elin discovered that true strength isn't found in never falling, but in rising each time with greater understanding of both human frailty and resilience. What burdens would you be willing to bear to save someone you love? What betrayals could you forgive when understanding finally dawns? If this story touched your heart, remember that sharing it allows these ancient echoes of sacrifice and redemption to reach others who might need them. Subscribe to hear more tales that challenge us to find the humanity in even the most broken souls, and leave a like if Elin's journey moved you. After all, we all face moments where we must decide what matters most, the judgment of the world or the truth in our hearts.